Good morning. Glad you're all here. For those of you watching later, glad you've picked up the video. We're going to be doing the part 2 of the last chapter of Knowing Jesus for the Old Testament. We're not going to finish. We're going to save the last third for next week. So that'll be exciting. And then we will finish this book, and I'm looking forward to your suggestions as to another book, possible ideas for studies. We have lots of different options to go with. I mean, obviously, there's lots of different books. We could do a topic. We could look at all kinds of different ideas and concepts if you would like. And all I need are some suggestions. So I'm just grabbing my bag of books here. I got books all over the place. But like I said, I'm willing to look at philosophy, theology, religion, apologetics. We could do the history of different religious movements. We could do something completely different and do something that would be anti-Christian, like The Antichrist by Nietzsche, or any number of books that are completely against all things the Bible. There's all kinds of options. So if you are interested in giving me your thoughts and let me know what you're thinking, that'd be great. So otherwise, let's start. As we go through, feel free to throw questions or comments into the comment thing. If you're watching it later, you can still comment, but understand that if it's not 10 a.m. right now, you are not actually watching the live stream, and I will not be able to comment on your comments. We had a couple folks at one point who had commented on the video after the fact, and which is great, but you're not going to get a response because I'm not there. Okay, so let's look at, we're on page 209. This should be a fairly short study, but I think it's important to wrap our minds around for the sake of this particular book and understanding all the ins and outs of his argument. But it will be a short read by comparison. So anyway, so we're on page 209. And we're this is like halfway or 1/3 of the way through chapter 5, which is the last chapter. This guy has 5 chapters for a book this big, and it's crazy by comparison. Not that my book is the epitome or anything. I purposefully make my books with very short chapters for the sake of ease, so a person can read one chapter in a 10-minute sitting if they're even a slow reader, you know. So this is one of the books I wrote. You know, see the comparison of the thickness there, and my book, by comparison, has 46 chapters. That might be excessive. I don't know. But 46 chapters. And each chapter leads into the next chapter, and so on and so forth. You know, I never thought about it, but this could be a book that we go through. Also, too, I have a new book I just wrote called Flexible Faith. And it's very thin, again, by comparison to other books. And even this super thin book has 10 chapters. So there's 10 chapters compared to Wright's 5. So maybe we'll do that. I don't know. We'll see. Depends on what the people want. And I'm here to give the people what they want. So we left off. We had read through He talked about the Sabbath law and how man was not made for the Sabbath. And then we go to 209, and it says the law's scales of value, or the law's scale of values. And this is kind of interesting because this is kind of an apologetics section where he defends scripture a little bit. And there are lots of really good books on the topic. I was given a couple of free books and asked to do reviews of the books for Amazon a couple of years ago. And there are just lots of books that are on the topic of apologetics and the Old Testament, and how the Old Testament was actually progressive for the time is the main argument. And it was, and we'll see that as we go through. He says, when one of the teachers of the law asked Jesus what was the greatest command in the law, it was a significant question. The rabbis of the day debated it. If you know, if you study the history of the first century in theology or religion at the time, very, very, very debated topic. There were two schools of thought for the most part. The Pharisees and the Sadducees were in disagreement over it, and they would ask each other questions. So when you look at the New Testament, it's interesting because they said, should we pay taxes? That was a question that was being heavily debated at the time. What's the greatest commandment? Heavily debated at the time. All the questions, and literally all of the questions that we have in the New Testament that Jesus is asked and then Jesus comments on or answers, were topics that were being debated at the time. And you can actually read the answers of the of the people who were debating the topics all the way back then. It's really interesting. We have those documents, and they're very well documented, and you can read the debates, and it does add some context and flavor to the comments of Jesus, because Jesus is not, they're not just bringing these questions out of nowhere. They're actually asking him questions that were being debated by the top rabbis of the day. So anyway, so he says, when Jesus answered it, he said to love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. And he gave the twist at the end. And this was what was different from the answers of the other rabbis. The one, I forget the rabbi's name off the top of my head. I should have looked all this information up. I'm pulling it from memory. I took a class at the UW, Jewish education in the first century. It was very interesting, through the education school. But I think it was Shammai, I think his name was. Anyway, he had basically said something along the lines of, love your neighbor as yourself and love God, something like that. But he was close to what Jesus had said. But Jesus adds this, and then these two commandments, everything else hangs from these two commandments. And that's a really strong statement for a Jewish person, especially at this time, because they believed that, and were taught that every single law, every single jot and tittle, is what they would say, was God breathed and therefore all equal. So that's why the debate was so strong, was, how can we sum up the law in some kind of pithy way when every single aspect of the law is essential to righteousness? And when Jesus says that these are the two, and he sums it up with two, and then he says everything else hangs from it like a coat rack. It sounds, again, to us, it's like, oh, whatever. But to them, that would have been like mind blowing, because that says that those are the two criterion to judge all the rest of the law of the prophets. That was a big deal. It says they are the scale and criteria by which the rest of everything else should be ordered. Mark's account, it says, you are right. And Jesus is asked a question, and he responds, and he says, you are right in saying that God is one. There is no other but him. To love him with all your heart, with all your understanding, with all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself is more important than all the burnt offerings and sacrifices. Again, for us, we even an atheist or a person of a different religion, we take a lot of this stuff for granted. We don't practice religious systems for the most part where we burn things and sacrifice animals or whatever. So we take that for granted. But again, when Jesus says this would have been mind-blowing, because Jesus says that there are some things in the law that God prefers over the other things. So Jesus is saying that not every single bit of it is as important as another. Also, too, this is part of the reason why this is so controversial. And I'm looking for a book while I'm saying this. The other reason why this is so controversial, yeah, I'll have to look for it later, is because this also is, Jesus is saying that there is some sort of situational ethic that we have to follow. So Jesus isn't saying that sacrifices are inherently bad, but he says that to love your neighbor as yourself is more important than burnt offerings and sacrifices. That means that situationally, there are situations wherein you ignore the sacrifices for the sake of helping somebody else. And Jesus used the example in the last chapter we talked about last Wednesday of King David and his army, his troops, his little militia, going into the temple and eating the temple sacrificed bread. That was sacrilegious to a lot of people. But Jesus says David didn't do anything wrong, because David understood that people and their hunger and their basic needs as a human being are more important than the sacrifices in the temple, because God doesn't need the sacrifices. So again, situationally, from one perspective, he was stealing from the plate of God. But Jesus says, no, nothing wrong with sacrifices. It's good that we have gratitude. It's good that we show our gratitude in culturally relevant ways. But if you are sacrificing a bushel of apples to a statue, hypothetically, or in the case of the temple, as a sacrifice to God, but there's a person starving to death, God would rather you in that situation give those apples to that person and not put them in the temple. It's really opens a lot of stuff. Also, too, he makes this passing comment of, because this guy was so close to the truth, he says, you are not far off from the kingdom of God. And that's interesting, because it's important for us to understand that there are people, even in the church, who are not saved because they are just so close. They got all of the right stuff for the most part, but they're missing that relationship with Jesus Christ. And they're just so close to the kingdom of God. And Jesus actually at one point says that he loves this person and he loves these people, even though they are not following, they're not actually worshiping God. So he goes into here. First of all, number one, God comes first. The three commandments related, he says there are three commandments related directly to God as at the head of the list, the first three. The first and the 10th correspond to each other, and they have to do with covetousness. But the problem, again, is that it's actually more than that, because when it comes to covetousness, we're told that it is idolatry. Great book by Odin. It's called Guilt Free. Very short little book. But he talks about how a lot of the guilt we suffer is because of idolatry. It's because it's not healthy guilt. It's not godly, repentant guilt. It is this unnecessary, garbage guilt that we feel, or it's guilt that we feel even though we've been forgiven, and we should be letting go of this suffering and the pain that we're causing ourselves. And he says it's because of idolatry. It's the things that we are putting above, our own lives, and we're judging. Anything you judge yourself by can become an idol. Not necessarily is, but it can become an idol. So it's important to understand that covetousness is also something dealing with our worship of God. And he says, after God and his name comes the Sabbath, which, as we have seen, was for the benefit of the whole community, especially for workers. Then the family, the individual life, marriage, property, judicial process, God, society, family, sex, individuals, property. He says that this is, kind of goes against our Western culture, right? Because it goes God, society, family, individuals, sex, property. And the demand of putting God before all else could be costly, obviously. Deuteronomy 13 warns Israel against the insidious temptation to be drawn away from their total loyalty to God because of idolatry. He talks about religious leaders, talks about your family. And it's really important that we understand the importance of family, especially in the Bible, but not just in the Bible, but generally in the world of that time and across cultures. He says here, in the law, every effort was made to protect the family and to preserve its economic well-being. Individuals got their primary sense of identity from the wider family. So when I was studying ancient Greek, we had to read all kinds of random stuff, and a lot of it's court cases. And court cases were very different than they are now. You couldn't have a lawyer. You had to defend yourself. You could have a lawyer write something up for you that you read, but you had to do it yourself. It's a different system. And the writings we have are oftentimes one-sided, because the court cases didn't have somebody typing all of the information out and recording the entire proceedings. What they had was, we oftentimes today have is one paper, either the defense or the prosecutor, and we can read those, but we rarely have both preserved, which is unfortunate. So one of the court cases I read was a man who was on trial for murder in Greece. And what happened is that he found out that his wife was cheating on him. And anytime he would go out of town, she would cheat on him. So what he did was he told his wife, he lied and said, I'm going out of town. And he went away for a day. And rather than actually leave, he stayed with a neighbor. And so to have the right to murder somebody, this will make sense in a minute, you had to have a witness, and you had to be able to prove that the person was cheating with your wife, because the family was so important that you could protect your family by murdering somebody. So if you caught the person in the act of having sex with your spouse, you had the right to kill them. So the guy set this trap, basically. He said that, hey, I'm leaving town. He went to his neighbor's house, got a couple of witnesses. He waited and watched. Then when this adulterer showed up and walked in the building, he gave the dude a little bit of time to get himself situated. And then he and his witnesses snuck into the building, went upstairs, and then saw the witnesses, and everybody witnessed the act of sex between between his wife and this gentleman. At that point, game is on. So the husband now has the right to murder the man. And so he chases the guy. And the only caveat is that if you could get yourself to the prayer closet, if you could get yourself to the space where the house idols were, you could throw yourself on the horns of mercy, basically, and throw yourself at the mercy of the gods. At that point, the person could not kill you. They had to give you mercy, and then the adulterer would be charged in court. So what happened was, the husband ran faster than the naked man who was trying to run himself to the prayer closet, and the husband beat him to death. And that's the whole case. And then another quirky thing, terrible thing about Greece, they had slaves. And the testimony of slaves was not considered to be legitimate unless they were beaten. So then the slave was actually tortured, and then the slave gave their information, their eyewitness account as well. And anyway, so I have no idea if the dude was charged with murder or if he got away with it. But the point is that in the law of the Greeks, it was so important to protect the family that you could murder somebody for sleeping with your spouse, because that would be, somebody infringing on or trying to wreck your family, a home wrecker. So imagine, if that were true today, jeepers. I mean, people would be killing people all over the place. But again, it's not just a Hebrew culture thing. The Greeks did it. The Egyptians did it. I'm assuming Babylon did it. I can't remember the exact law. Anyway, but I'm pretty sure that Babylon did it as well, had laws in place where you could actually kill an adulterer. But the whole point is to protect their family. So what do you do if your loyalty to God conflicts with your loyalty to your family, for example? That was a big question. What if my my family are worshiping false gods, but I want to honor my family, but they're worshiping false gods. But I can't do both. I can still love my family, but I can't honor them in the sense of follow in their footsteps and do what they're doing. So he says Deuteronomy answers was uncompromising. Jesus warns his disciples the claims of the reign of God must come before family, before your own life, before everything. God is first. He says, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, his wife and children, his brother and sisters, he says, even his own life, he can't be my disciple. And this verse is just regularly abused by atheists and people who are angry about things. And Jesus is not saying that you have to hate your mom and dad or your brothers and sisters, obviously. He is saying that by comparison, your love for God, your love for your parents, I should say, should be hate by comparison to your love for God. Not that you should hate your parents, obviously, because Jesus, he even goes on to actually say this. He says, Jesus berated the Pharisees for trying to nullify the law of honoring your parents. Jesus 100% believed you should love your parents. Absolutely. Jesus believed you should love children, take care of your kids. Jesus says that there's a special place in hell, or not. I'm exaggerating, but he says that there is better for a person to have a millstone tied around their neck and be thrown in the ocean than to turn a child away. And imagine like a child molester or a rapist, or any of these other things. Those were all things that Jesus was 100% against. You need to take care of your family, obviously. Paul reiterated and said that people who don't take care of their families are worse than unbelievers, he said, which again, at that time would have been a huge insult. So anyway, point is that Jesus obviously meant for us to love our parents, but they were concerned. Number 2, page 212. Persons matter more than things. Nothing in the Bible says that stuff is worth more than a person. There's lots of things for the death penalty, and a good way for us to wrap our minds around, because there's like death penalty for a lot of random stuff in the New Testament or the Old Testament. But you got to think about it more in terms of and this is my personal argument, and I don't have time to explain it and defend it. But I would say is that when it says that a person should be killed for this or killed for this or killed for this, or this and this and this should happen, there was always the caveat added in at some point throughout the Deuteronomy and different law texts that was the limit, the worst case scenario. Like, it's bad. That was the limit. So nowadays in court, we'll say, this felony charge has a limit of 25 years. Well, how many times do people get the full 25 years? Not often, unless it's a heinous crime. So, for example, the Old Testament literally says that the death penalty, you can get the death penalty for being rebellious against your parents. Again, they don't make any attempt to define what that means. And but the thing is that even though there's a death penalty for rebellious children, there is not one single instance in any Jewish history of a parent ever taking that and running with it and having their child killed for being mouthy or something. So the point is, though, is that there were limits on the limit was death. And there are lots of things like idolatry and different things. Murder obviously would have been the death penalty, but not necessarily, but that was the limit. You couldn't kill a person's parents. If a guy murdered your wife, you couldn't kill his wife. The limit was you can kill him, but you can't kill his wife. You can't kill his family because he killed your family, even because their family or his family is not culpable or responsible for his action. The limit would be you can kill him. Where in other cultures, they could just kill your whole family. They could kill your son if you killed their son, even by accident. So it was progressive in that way, where the individual person was responsible, not the entire family. But the death penalty was for all kinds of different things. And he says, this shows how seriously Israel took these things, even though there is relatively sparse evidence that executions ever happened for most of these things. It's possible that in many cases execution was the maximum penalty. I just argued that. And like I said, I could make a better argument if I had time, but that's not the point. In Israelite law, no offense involving property ever carried the death penalty. And that's important. You go to Babylon and you go to Mesopotamia, you go to these different cultures, and they would be, without a doubt, they would be killing people for stealing. They would be cutting your hands off. Even in Islamic law today, it's a thing where you can take a person's hand for stealing, where the Bible specifically says you can't take a person's hand for stealing because that's like a death sentence. And it's also detrimental to the society because within Jewish and Christian culture, there's always supposed to be a culture of taking care of the poor and the sick and the needy. So if you and I are taking care of the poor and the sick and the needy, we don't want to create more poor, sick, and needy people. I mean, just as for a very practical reason. So they never had any kind of capital offense or physical punishment for stealing, for example, or for the loss of property. It says here, the reason: no amount of material property was worth a human life. Page 213. He says kidnapping, the theft of a person. So kidnapping was a capital crime. If somebody kidnapped your kid, you could kill them. The maximum sentence was death. But stealing my cow or stealing my wallet, not a capital offense. Number 3, needs matter more than rights. This is where the Old Testament is very progressive by comparison to its peers. The Code of Hammurabi and different groups or different law texts were prehistoric by comparison to these rules. So it says the Hebrew law tries to restrain the rights of the stronger party and attend to the needs of the weaker. There's lots of examples of that with here, for example, runaway slaves. It says if a slave has taken refuge with you, you cannot hand them over to their master. Let them live with you and do not oppress them. So this was a runaway slave right. So if a slave ran away, you were commanded to not give the slave back. That would have been, this is a long time ago. I mean, we had laws in the United States that a slave had to be returned to their owners. Not that long ago, relatively speaking. And this was written in Deuteronomy, which you're talking probably 2,500 to 3,000 years ago. Long time ago. But you couldn't return a slave to their slave owner. Hebrew law swims against the stream and puts the needs of the slave first before the rights of the owner. And then this law undermines the whole institution of slavery. And it's interesting. This part of the problem is people don't realize when they're reading the Old Testament that it's written in a context that's very, very ancient and very, very brutal. So God was changing the culture from the inside out, and that began with progressive laws. But God, it would not have taken off. It would not have caught on had it been 100% what we would consider to be fair today. It was already very controversial at the time it was written. So for the people, even then, where we see like slavery is allowed, it's more of an indentured servitude oftentimes, but whatever, slavery is allowed, but it's more like tolerated. And then we have laws in place for slaves to be freed at the year of Jubilee. So slavery was never meant to be a lifetime thing, and people were never meant to be property. But that was the culture of the time. So God put in place laws that would eventually free those people without overturning the entire system, because again, people would just ignore it if it weren't for it being a little progressive and just changing things slowly but surely, and then it finds its fulfillment in Christ, as we see. Female captives, for example, rape was illegal. You couldn't go raping and pillaging your neighboring villages. If you did kill, if you did have a war, and oftentimes, even in garrisons, there were women and children sometimes, because women followed armies because of people's wives were trying to be fed, and that was the best place to be together. But you killed an entire army, hypothetically, took the men hostage or took them as captives, and the women were left over. Again, it's terrible for us to think about this, but they would become property almost. Well, not in Israel. So it says here that if you have these women, what would happen is that you couldn't rape them, you couldn't force them to have sex with you, you couldn't do any of those things. There's actually laws in place where you had to allow them mourn. You had to allow them a full month of just, mourning the loss of their parents, the loss of their mom and dad, the loss of their husband, even maybe. You had to give them time. Then, if you still wanted to be with them, you had to give them all the rights of a spouse. You couldn't just, rape and then kick this woman to the curb. You had to make her your wife. And so within Israel, that would have been a hard sell, because wives had a lot of rights. So you might want to just, have sex with this person because she's beautiful, but at the end of the day, according to Hebrew law, you had to give her all the rights of your home, meaning that she would have the right to inherit your property. Her children would have the right to take away to inherit your stuff. There was a lot involved. And it says that if at the end of the day, if you're like, you know what, I changed my mind, you couldn't sell her, you couldn't make her a slave, and you can't mistreat her even. So she still had all the rights of a wife, but then she would have just had the rights of like a divorced wife. Again, as we know in the Old and the New Testament, divorce was condemned, but allowed not because it was ideal or because it was God's plan, but because we are terrible human beings, and we have all kinds of things that God allows us to do, but not because they're good, but because we're just terrible. So he allows those things, but just allowing them doesn't mean that he approves of them. Oh, and then here it actually says here, 2:15, the law of Moses permitted a lot of things and didn't approve of it. Divorce is a great example. Jesus even says that God allowed it, but didn't approve of it. Another example is polygamy. Situationally, again, you have a culture where women are not valued as highly as they are today, and women didn't have a lot of rights and whatever else. And also, too, men died very, very young. So more women were around oftentimes in some of these cultures than men. If there was a war, you might be 6-1 girls to guys. In those cultures at that time, it was allowed for somebody to marry more than one wife. But again, that was an allowance for the sake of the women, not because guys are perverts, but some guys are. Because the thing is that a woman's retirement was children. So by allowing a man to take his brother's wife, for example, if the brother died at war, the wife could choose to marry the brother, and then they would have a kid, and that child would actually inherit all of the brother's property and take care of the mom. It was a retirement system, and it worked out well for a long time. Obviously not ideal, but for the time when they didn't have an infrastructure like we do, it was better than the alternative. Debtor's pledge on 2:16. Debt is degrading. It can become dehumanizing, no doubt. Example is says, do not take a pair of millstones as security for a debt, because that's the guy's livelihood. It also says, if you can't take a guy's cloak as a pledge and then for debt and then steal the guy's cloak, because the guy can't sleep if he doesn't have a cloak. A cloak would have been like a blanket you wear. And for a person living on the street, especially, they need their blanket to be able to sleep. And you can't take away a person's blanket. Point is that people were valued more than stuff. So when it came to debts and loans, you were permitted to give debts and loans, and you were permitted to give somebody, something in exchange for the debt, some kind of a security. Like, for example, your house to the bank. The bank technically owns your house, but you were not allowed to steal away anything or take a pledge of anything that would destroy their livelihood or their right to just basic human needs. And this doesn't include houses. It was not a human need. But if a person had no home, you could not take away their blanket because they needed to sleep somewhere. So like those kinds of very, very basic needs, but you couldn't take away a person's basic needs, even if they had debt. Gleaning in the harvest. Great example of the welfare system in the Old Testament, where the people of the poor and the destitute had to work for their food. They didn't just line up and get a check mailed to them at their house and get their rent paid or whatever. A person had to do is the farmers would go and plow their fields, and then they would harvest their grain. And then the poor were allowed to go through the fields after they were done and glean, take what they wanted from the fields, and just take what they could from the edges and whatever. Even before the harvest, you were allowed to just pick a couple of grains and eat them, because people just needed to eat. Because God says the land is mine. All the land is mine, and you're just my tenants. So even though you own the property, even God's like, yeah, you own it because I allow it. And it's my land. And if you have stuff growing on it, people need to eat. and people starving to death, that's a problem. They get to eat food. They get to eat from that field. It doesn't mean that they can, and there's actually rules in place. The poor could not go in and harvest a whole bunch and then sell it. They could eat as much as they could eat. That's what they were allowed to do. They weren't even allowed, I think, to take some home. I think they were just allowed to eat what they could until the field was actually plowed. Then after the harvest, then they could take some home and make some bread or something. Anyway, point is that it's important to take care of gleaning the harvest, and then feeding your employees was another thing. You have to give your employees a living wage. That was an important point. On page 218, the Sabbath controversy illustrates this most clearly. Human hunger comes before human regulations. God said in Hosea, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Again, Jesus was not saying anything new. He was just clarifying for the folks who had misunderstood the text. And he was explaining what it actually meant. Because God was the marginalized were very important to God. Racism is not allowed in the economy of the Old and New Testament. Racism, sexism, all those different things were all frowned upon strongly. And the foreigner is protected in the Old Testament and the New Testament. 2:19, the authority of Jesus. Jesus says, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've come to fulfill them. So this was an argument that people had been making for a long time, that Jesus was actually going there to destroy the law, because he was saying that, that people could ignore certain portions of the law when it suited them. At least that's what they thought. But Jesus wasn't saying that. He wasn't saying that you can just ignore the law when you feel like it. He was saying there are times where you can ignore the rules because there are other things that are a priority. For example, a person who's starving to death. If a person is starving to death and you're bringing a couple of loaves of bread to the temple to offer them as a sacrifice of gratitude to the Lord, and you see a person starving to death, God is okay with you giving that person who's starving to death some bread. And not giving the sacrifice to the temple. It says Jesus was bringing into full clarity the inherent values and priorities of the Torah. The Torah itself, carefully read and understood, declares its own scale of values and sense of priorities. (220) The law in itself gave no life. Life came from the source of the law, which is God. For it is upon our active response to Jesus' words that our security and destiny depend, he says at the bottom of the page. The immediate cause of crowds' astonishment after the Sermon on the Mount was the way it ended, with Jesus' story of the two house builders. The critical difference between the wise man and the foolish man was not over their obedience to the law, but their response to Jesus. Jesus is the reason. 2:21, Pharisees were plotting to kill Jesus. And the thing is that there were, again, it's important for us to understand that these were arguments that were already happening. People were saying things that the Jews 100% disagreed with. There were debates that were happening even between sects within Judaism, but they weren't killing people over it generally. Not that there probably wasn't a barroom brawl that happened once or twice, but this wasn't something where they systematically got together and were like, hey, this dude is bad. We got to take this guy out. That wasn't happening. And that's why it's important for us to understand, why was it so important to remove Jesus from the equation? That's what makes all the difference. And the reason is because Jesus was demanding allegiance to him and his teaching. And that was going to ruin the authority of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the temple priests. So he claimed authority over the Sabbath, for example. He claimed the ability to forgive sins, which was idolatrous at the time. He invited people to take his yoke upon themselves rather than the yoke of the law. Jesus says, carry my yoke. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. The idea of the yoke, again, was an Old Testament and first century idea, and the law was considered a yoke. And Jesus told people, no, just take my yoke. And as soon as he said that, man, that was people getting angry again. People getting angry, like, what? Who do you think you are? What is you? You're nobody. Why do you think you're so important? By putting himself in that place, Jesus threatened the whole system, he says. And we're going to stop there. So we'll stop at Jesus and the prophets. And we will take off from there for Jesus and the prophets. And we'll carry on from that point. I can't put that away. But anyway, so that's where we're going to end. 45 minutes. That's a good run. I like 45 minutes. It makes it easy to read, and it also offers opportunities for asking questions. I wish there were more questions rather than just gibberish that gets pushed into the whatever, the feed there. But if you guys have any questions, as always, people do occasionally send questions via email, or you can call the church during our office hours from 9 to 1, Tuesday through Thursday. Otherwise, my biggest question for you is, what is the next book or topic you'd like to do? If I do not get some kind of consensus, I will make a decision based upon my own likes and dislikes, and that'll be okay. And I will continue to just keep teaching the class. But I think that it would be good for us to be able to work together and maybe have an idea for ourselves, like what, and come to some kind of consensus. So anyway, if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to give it 1 minute. All right. God bless you guys, and I will see you on Sunday.